Hey folks, so this past weekend I was at a family reunion and there's several musicians amongst us as well as several preachers. One of my cousins is actually a bishop at a local church here. And we were playing music and then we got into this discussion about arts and Christianity and how the church treats artists. And I have had a burr in my saddle about this for the 15 years or more. And so I decided I want to make a little video and talk about the church and the arts and what bugs me about this. So here we go. To give you a little perspective on where I'm coming from, I grew up in a pretty conservative church. It was called an Amish Mennonite church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And they had just recently allowed musical instruments when my family joined, so it was kind of a new thing. But I was playing and recording from a very early age, 12, 13 years old. And so when I was maybe 16, I started doing gigs at the local coffee shop. And the bishop heard about this. And he called me. He's like, hey, man, I got to take you out to eat. We got to talk about some stuff. So, all right. So I went out and met him. And he said, look, you can't be doing this music stuff. It says in our standard book that, we're not supposed to be professional entertainers. And I responded by saying, well, I'm not a professional entertainer. This is a hobby because it's not my profession, which admittedly is a little smart-alecky, but I just want to give you a perspective here, okay? The other thing that happened that was a much worse situation for me was several years later, and my band was asked to play a benefit for a sick child in the church. So my band played a show, and I know I put some country songs in there. There was Tennessee Flat Top Box. There was several Don Williams songs, probably I'll Be Here in the Morning, all good, clean, kind of uplifting country songs. And the show went well. The bill got paid. And several days later, I got a call from the bishop. And he was really kind of upset and concerned, and he said, I was really disappointed in your performance the other night. And I said, oh, really? What was going on? Or what did you have a problem with? And he said, well, you put some country songs in there that really stirred up some immoral thoughts and some bad feelings among some of the members who've just coming out of the world and that lifestyle, And I said, really, what song was that? I couldn't think. And he said, well, Tennessee Flat Top Box, he said, was one of them. And I was just kind of shocked. And without thinking, I said, well, maybe they have some unprocessed shame or something about their past life that they're not able to deal with this. I was like, if you can't hear Tennessee Flat Top Box without your mind going to the gutter or that stirring bad things up, you have a bigger problem than Conrad Fisher. And that enraged him, and he said, oh, that's a pretty shabby thing to say, and hammered me pretty hard on it. And it hurt me. That made me very uncomfortable. So it was a tense situation, and luckily at the time I was headed out. I was going to move out to Juniata County and attend a different church. So he didn't have to excommunicate me, and I didn't have to excommunicate him. We just kind of went our separate ways. But I use that story because I think it illustrates what happens a lot of times in churches. Admittedly, artists are eccentric individuals. I know I'm a little weird, and I do some stuff that's offbeat sometimes. I don't always keep my head down and toe the line. I'm trying stuff, I'm creative, I'm doing stuff. That's on me, right? But a lot of times what happens is the church gets uncomfortable with that, and instead of guiding and fostering that and shaping it in a way that, takes art forward, they put the hammer down and says, shape up or ship out. And I think a lot of artists do that and not only ship out, but react against that and then spin off way out there far left in a reactionary kind of thing where they're not serving the church at all or doing gospel music or whatever. And this applies to more than music. This applies to, novelists, any kind of writer, painters, any kind of creative expression. I think this happens a lot. I just talk about music because that's my experience and what I know. Now, I will interject here by saying there was an older man in church that I called, somebody I respected because it wounded me so much. I called somebody, I was like, hey, I want to talk about this. And I drove in to see him. And he kind of encouraged me. He said, look, I understand where the bishop's coming from, but he said, I see what the intent of your heart is, and I think you're doing a good thing, and I encourage you to keep doing it. And that meant the world to me. And I think it's one of the reasons why I didn't, just say, this is all bad, church is stupid, and I'm out of here. Because I was at that, at that level of intensity, I was that disappointed and hurt. The byproduct of this is that art in the church suffers because creative people leave when they're not tolerated. They don't feel comfortable in these spaces where the church shuts them down. And what happens is the art in church, it's just not good a lot of times. It's not all bad, but I don't listen to a lot of Christian music. I don't find that it's very innovative or, inspiring. I was talking to a Christian radio promoter several years ago now, and he said, the church always follows secular trends in music, or often. And the two examples he had about 4 or 5, but the ones I can remember were Adele. Pop culture comes out with Adele, and she's massively successful. And then the church follows it with someone like Lauren Daigle, who has like a similar aesthetic, similar, sound about her. And the other example is Mumford & Sons, which is, a big secular band. And then 2 years later, whatever, Rend Collective comes along, which is like the Christian counterfeit, but the same aesthetic, just with Christian, words and music or whatever. And I think this is a shame because as Christians, we're supposed to be in touch with the Creator. We're supposed to be like this, right? With the Creator. And that should mean that we are the most creative. We should be setting the trends. We should be writing the best songs, playing the best instruments. And it's not the case most often. Madeleine L'Engle has a great quote where she says in her book, Walking on Water, she says, "Bad art is bad religion, no matter how pious the subject." And that hurts because there's a lot of bad art in the church. I know when I grew up, they're still going today. It's called The Companions. It's a little Sunday school handout with these stories about how, little Timmy disobeyed father and left the gate open, and then his dog Duke got hit on the road. Those kinds of stories. Horribly written. Great morals. I mean, yeah, you got to obey dad, right? But not engaging, predictable, bad writing, objectively bad art. And it's just used, to teach a lesson. But it's not good art. Martin Luther also has a great quote where he says, "The Christian shoemaker does his duty not by putting tiny crosses on his shoes, but by making really great shoes, because God is interested in great workmanship." And I love that. I believe that. The scripture says, whatever you find to do it with your might and do it well. That means if you're a carpenter, you can honor God by building a house really well. Like God is honored when you use the right materials, you don't cut corners, you build something that's great. That's a form of worship. I really believe that. And that's how I've always approached songwriting and art. It becomes a problem in the church, though, because for some reason there's this disconnect when it comes to art. The church would never require a carpenter to only build hospitals and schools and churches. It's like, nah, man, you can build whatever. But when it comes to art, the push is for a Christian artist to do strictly songs about God, Jesus, the Bible, and whatever. And I never understood that, because I feel like if I write a great song that's uplifting, or that just paints a good picture, or tells a story, or teaches a lesson, or just something that's objectively good art, God is honored by that. So, I'll get hassled. You see it in the comments, sad to see you slipping. Why don't you record more gospel songs? And my response is, all my songs are gospel songs. I'm a believer. It comes out in everything I do. I don't have to Jesus juke everything for you to know that I'm a Christian. The other thing that often happens with this is that artists who do want to remain in the church do so by using it as a platform. So if you're a gospel entertainer, you'll get invited to churches everywhere, and you can make a whole tour of the United States just getting booked at churches. And sometimes I've seen this abused as someone who is fulfilling some other kind of crazy ego trip where it's like they want to be a singer, and so they feel called by God to do this, and they really shouldn't be doing it because they're doing it for some other reason. It's an ego trip for them, or they just want to be an entertainer. And songwriters do this too. I cannot tell you how many horrible songs that people have sent me, and they have told me that God gave them this song. And God doesn't give you stupid songs. People have blamed God for some of the worst pieces of garbage that I've ever seen come into my inbox. And that sounds harsh, but that's what happens when we treat artists that way, And it's really, really sad to me because it happens all across the board. Now, two exceptions to this the people that I admire are J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. J.R. Tolkien wrote all the Lord of the Rings stuff and a bunch of other great books. C.S. Lewis did Chronicles of Narnia and much more than that, but those were their two great works. Both of them you can learn biblical principles. It comes through that they're believers, but it's not limited to a Christian audience because it's great art. It's great art, and it's been successful on a massive level because of that. So back to this Martin Luther quote about the shoes. I often get asked to do gospel-only shows. People say, hey, we want you to come, but can you behave yourself and just do gospel? I had even a guy write in the contract, must be 80% gospel songs. And I approach this two different ways based on what kind of event it is. If it's church and the objective of the service is to worship and to meet God, in a building on Sunday morning, I will lead in worship. I'll facilitate that. I'll sing songs about the Bible and about Jesus. And yes, there's a time and a place for that. But if this is some kind of Saturday afternoon picnic in the park, I won't sign a contract that says I have to play 80% gospel music because I feel like the church wants to be entertained but doesn't want to be honest about it. Sometimes you just want a funny man to sing a funny song, tell a funny story, and go home and be happy. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing in the world wrong with that. But the church wants to Jesus juke everything so that they feel like okay with having that fun. At least that's been my experience. And I don't play those games. I've lost a lot of gigs because of that. But I don't really care because I tell those people, like I told you, all my songs are gospel because I'm a believer. If you don't trust me, then don't book me. And we'll be we'll be fine. That does not fly very well in a lot of churches, not just conservative Mennonite churches, even Baptist and Presbyterian and Methodist. People just don't like to hear that, and I think it's a shame. Another angle to this is I actually respect gospel music too much to use it to entertain people. I don't think you should entertain people with Jesus songs. It means more than that. So if you just want to have a good time, let me sing Tennessee Flat Top Box. Do you know what I mean? There's nothing wrong with it. It's great. So where does that leave us? I don't know, man. But if you're an artist out there who's in church and you're feeling a little squashed, I think it's important to have a little bit of grace for where you are and to recognize that you are a weirdo. or you can be a weirdo sometimes, and how jarring that is to people who don't understand what you're doing, and maybe use their criticism of your life and examine yourself and see, well, maybe I am off the wall here. Maybe I should behave myself and not sing Tennessee Flat Top Box at a fundraiser for, a kid in church. I don't know. Sometimes your enemies have good criticism, even if it comes in a hard way. But if you're in a place where they're squashing you to the point of it's destroying God's calling in your life, man, you got to get out. Find somewhere you're comfortable. And if you're a church leader or someone in authority out there and you're struggling with a guy like me 15 years ago, I encourage you to be really gentle with them and see the value that they can bring to your church or your congregation and try to foster that and steer it into good ways instead of bringing the hammer down and sending them flying, because that will be bad for your church and it will be bad for the individual. So I hope this was helpful. It was helpful for me to process just talking about it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Look, I know I may be well off base on some of this stuff, but I've had a little bit of experience in this and I'm curious to hear your thoughts and your stories. Until next time, y'all have a good one.